ideas of moral purity, that we as individuals can somehow be separate from extractive and destructive and harmful economic processes, and that this purity is desirable and that we can have a hierarchy of who is more pure. Some of that is important and coming from a good place. That being said, though, the current economy doesn't acknowledge our right to be able to live in right relationship with other living beings. We are not enabled to live undestructive lives.
Welcome to the Moral Footprint Podcast. I'm your host, Jeni Miles, and this is where I speak with leading thinkers on how we bridge the gap between individual and systemic transformation. Most of us are taught to think of finance as money moving from where it is to where it's needed. But what if the whole system rests on a story about the economy that leaves out nature and energy from the very beginning? And what if that's why even so-called sustainable finance so often turns out to be not very sustainable at all? That's the thread that my guest today pulls on, and it goes so much deeper than I expected. Anastasia Linn is a practitioner and researcher working at the intersection of organisational behaviour, finance, and the just transition. She's originally from design and organisational psychology, which meant that when she stepped into the world of so-called sustainable finance, she could see really clearly just how far it had drifted from what sustainability really means. She's a co-founder of the Arketa Institute for Post-Growth Finance, and her background spans the Centre for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth, the World Climate Foundation, and the House of Beautiful Business. We get into why all of modern finance is built on neoclassical economics and what changes if you use the ecological economics frame instead. We talk about the pull so many of us feel to just walk away from extractive industries, but why staying inside them might be where your true leverage is. We get into moral purity and why chasing it might be the wrong goal entirely. And we also look at how even the actuaries, the people whose whole job is to price future risk, are quietly warning that ecological collapse threatens the entire financial system, even if institutions aren't saying it out loud. It's a conversation that doesn't flinch from how serious things are, but also lands somewhere genuinely hopeful, on the idea that hope isn't something that you wait for, it's something you build through action. So let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Anastasia Linn. Hey, Anastasia, thank you so much for being here today. We met in person last month at the World Beautiful Business Forum in Athens, and It was awesome to meet because you've been so great at helping to promote the research that I've been doing with the Post-Growth Transformation Lab at London School of Economics. But we didn't get much of a chance to chat about your work and how you got into this space of questioning finance and what it could or should be. So maybe we can start with your journey. How did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeni, and thanks for having me on. I can start this by saying I'm not a finance person by training. My first bachelor's was in design management, which is basically about facilitating creative problem solving in teams, design thinking type stuff, and other forms of kind of creating effective work environments. And after that, I was working primarily in strategic communications in a number of different organizations. And after a few years, decided I want to go further in the direction of organizational behavior, which we touched on in my first bachelor's. And actually, I wrote my thesis about psychological safety in design teams, which I think, given your background, is probably a theme that you're somewhat familiar with.
I need to read that.
Yeah, it was basically, my idea behind it was that I think that if people feel like they're in this environment of mutual trust and respect, that they'll be more likely to voice ethical concerns or share ideas that could relate to the ultimate sustainability of a product. And in my mind, already at that time, before I had heard about degrowth or anything, I was thinking sometimes the most sustainable solution would be to not invent the product at all, like to not create the product at all.
And that almost sounds quite radical, doesn't it? For a design team, just like, maybe we shouldn't design this, full stop.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't explicitly mention that in that paper, but that was really the kind of thinking that I was already having at that time. And I finished that program in 2018. And then, like I said, was working a number of places in between that, but then said, okay, I want to go further, like understanding the psychological dynamics of the just transition and the sorts of skills that we can collectively develop to better support each other through the just transition, so through big economic change. And I started a second bachelor's program here at the University of Zurich, which now, 5 years later, I'm hopefully done with.
Congrats.
Thank you so much. Yeah, still waiting the final results, but should be finished now. And now I was on this path of trying to understand these dynamics, and I felt like I could apply that in many different industries, like this idea of how can we reassure people that just because we don't want them to be doing the same exact job anymore, whether that's designing products that capture people's attention or feed into like addictive behavior, or oil executives or other people that are working in oil and gas that are maybe very competent at their jobs but are just doing jobs that we don't really need anymore. So I was thinking, okay, aviation, private mobility, oil and gas, but potentially also big tech or other areas of the economy. This could be relevant in any of those spaces. But during my second bachelor's, I was working at a place called the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth, which got me into this so-called sustainable finance space. And importantly, before that had happened, so I think around 2019, 2020, I was already aware of the degrowth movement, kind of like on the fringes, starting to make my way in. So I was already familiar with like ecological economics framings of the economy, and they made a lot of sense to me. And so entering this so-called sustainable finance space, I had those frames in mind. And it was very shocking to see from a relatively outside perspective how far the sustainable finance conversation was from what most of the people, say, in climate or sustainability spaces that I had already been in, understood as sustainability.
Yes, so almost like this sustainable finance is actually actively potentially unsustainable, and that must have been quite a shock for you. And you mentioned around like finance as usual and this idea of, I think, neoclassical economics and ecological economics. So obviously these are like big words that we're throwing around.
Yeah.
And so I think what would be really, really helpful is when we talk about the neoclassical economics, what is so wrong? How come even when we use that frame for sustainable finance, how can it be unsustainable? Can you help us make sense of that? As real people, it's bizarre.
Yeah, definitely. So neoclassical economics is what most people learn in university, say in a Econ 101 course, or the economics that, like, if you hear commentators on TV speaking, usually they're coming from that perspective and that discipline. It's so mainstream that it's sometimes not even talked about as such. So we're trying, we as part of a movement together with Rethinking Economics and others are trying to make that more obvious, but this is kind of economics as usual.
That's a very interesting framing, economics as usual, because I've been thinking so much about business as usual, but business is embedded in the broader economic system. So,
yeah, totally. So neoclassical economics, if we simplify a lot of it, you have ideas about supply and demand and market mechanisms that apply reasonably well to human markets, so human trade, goods and services. We often use this graphic, like in our first paper, where we see neoclassical economics as focusing on supply and demand, households and firms, and basically an exchange of value that goes in between them. That is, if we simplify, a perpetual motion machine. It's basically able to just go around forever. And the reason why that framing, or why that idea that, okay, the economy can kind of continue cycling in this way forever and the economy can keep growing forever, which follows from that logic, is that it doesn't account for nature or humans from the beginning. Basically,
it's like it's a fiction then. It's not even based on like material reality. And yet it's...
arguably not in the way that like natural sciences are trying to understand material reality. I think that mainstream economics has kind of distanced itself from that approach long ago. because in many ways, this neoclassical economic approach is fairly dogmatic. In many cases, it's provocative, unwanted, and defended against to even talk about alternatives, which is sort of a cultural challenge that organizations or networks like Rethinking Economics are trying to counter. But even if we accept the idea that, all right, Adam Smith and all this kind of classical or neoclassical stuff within economics worked reasonably well up until a point, what we can certainly say is that it's not working terribly well now in the 21st century, or even say for the last 50 years or so, when we're coming from what Herman Daly called empty world conditions and moving into a full world. So I'll explain what that means.
Oh, yes, please.
Empty world is the idea that when the economy was small enough, it could continue expanding, right? So we saw this, especially from like a Western European perspective. We cut down all the trees near where we used to live. And that was bad, but it doesn't really matter because we go somewhere else and we find more trees to cut down, and we're able to like keep feeding those resources into our economy in ways that allow it to keep growing. But now we're in a situation where the economy is so big that it's pushing up against, and in many cases, even surpassing what the planet can sustain. And we know that we're in a full world because of the planetary boundaries. I guess for listeners are familiar with that, but that's a model of indicators from Stockholm Resilience Center that track some of the most important things for enabling life on Earth. And we're not doing great if we look at the planetary boundaries as our compass.
When I first saw the planetary boundaries diagram and saw how many of the 9 boundaries we were already tipping, even 3 years ago, I think it was about 5 or 6, and now it's almost 7.
Yeah.
So it's very powerful to see that framing. And the work that you're doing with Arketa, it's about recognizing that we are in that full world now. We do have those planetary limits. So do you mind sharing a bit more about your approach, what you're working on right now? And also, how did you get there? How did you meet the other founders?
Yeah, sure. So I'll transition into that by saying one of the core proposals of Arketa Institute, which is that instead of this neoclassical economics approach, which we need to be clear is the basis for all of finance as we know it. That's to say, everything that we currently know in terms of finance practice is based on neoclassical economic ideas. That means that it does not take matter or energy into account from the beginning. Yeah.
When you say it out loud, I still am stopped in my tracks, but yes.
Yeah. And part of our purpose is to propose this idea of centering or applying ecological economics as an alternative to that, with the idea that if we use ecological economics as a foundation, which does include matter and energy from the beginning and includes waste outflows from the economy from the beginning, if we use that as the foundation, the way that so-called sustainable finance looks would be very different. We don't just have this idea of externalities tacked on to neoclassical economics to try to account for why, say, businesses cause all of this harm that we can't otherwise account for. But instead, we're looking at that more or less from the start. So as Arketa Institute, we're trying to normalize conversations around the limits to growth in finance and around ecological economics. In our experience, many financial professionals are actually aware of the issues of our day. So whether that's climate change or wealth inequality or biodiversity loss, aspects like this, particularly those of our peers that are working in this so-called sustainable finance sector. Like I said, all of finance is based on neoclassical economics. Every tool that they reach for is effectively flawed from the beginning because it integrates this neoclassical economics mindset. We should address that not as a shortcoming of individual people or necessarily finance as an industry, though I think that we also need to take accountability for what we've been doing over the last decades or centuries. But it shows us that there's a potential path and that we can develop a new toolkit based on ecological economics that could be much better suited to the challenges of the 21st century.
It's really great that you touched on, a lot of the financial professionals, they're all aware of our predicament. I think most people are now. And what other people will say, we need to just completely break this system, or we're going to completely opt out of it. And we spoke before about sometimes there is potentially a path from where you already are, still on the inside of the old. Maybe we can talk a bit more about how Arketa helps, because you talked about this shared toolkit. What might that look like, and how can we give people the idea of that you don't have to walk away from all the networks and identity that you've potentially built over the last decade or so?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Before you'd asked about my co-founders, and sharing a bit about their stories is a relevant place to start for the second question. So I co-founded Arketa Institute with Matt Orzach and Steve Rocco. Both of them are ex-Wall Street guys. Steve was at Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, Citibank, before getting into impact investing, before it was even called impact investing. He had a capital raising platform and continues to do impact investing work in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically for agriculture projects. So he took the path that we hope to make easier for others, going from mainstream finance to so-called sustainable or impact-related finance, to learning about ecological economics, which he somehow found on his own when he was so frustrated. Somehow he found ecological economics. I found Steve when I was working in impact investing at CSP and organizing this series of events with degrowth Switzerland called Exploring Post-Growth Finance. I saw Steve on LinkedIn making angry comments about degrowth in the impact investing world. Okay, there are so few people that are connecting these dots. Like, we need to talk.
You found the perfect Venn diagram for yourself. And Steve and I are at the intersection.
Yeah, exactly. He wanted to leave it all. That's very typical and understandable from a psychological perspective, because when you start to realize that things aren't working, when the cognitive dissonance of being a part of this extractive and harm perpetuating system comes into your awareness in a bigger way that you can no longer avoid, when you don't want to live with it anymore, the last thing that you want to do is stay in your job. So there's plenty of people that work in finance for several decades and then decide, I've had enough of that. Those were my bad years. Now I'm going to move to the countryside or
start a homestead.
Yes, exactly. My pottery studio, or pursue music as I've always wanted to do, and get out. And while I understand that for some people that's a sensible path, it's not one that facilitates any kind of significant change, because we just get out and meanwhile finance as usual continues turning, and it just cycles through people, and it's not really forced to evolve at all. What was powerful, I think, in Steve's story was he wanted to leave that all behind, become a professor and teach ecological economics. And over these years that we were in conversation, we realized actually a way for Steve to have so-called additionality, which is a word from impact investing world that means create positive change that wouldn't have happened without you.
Oh, I love that phrase. I need to make a note of that and have that as my goal.
Yeah, maybe. The extent to which we can measure that, it's difficult. But Steve could have additional impact that no one else could have by sharing his story and teaching ecological economics, not just to university students, but to his peers. That decision to stay somewhat connected to the industry is that he has pre-existing networks and pre-existing access and authority that other people don't have. And the same is true in different ways for Matt and I. Matt worked at the CFA Institute in the United States for many years in their think tank branch, and had been on his own journey. He was working primarily on sustainability and governance topics there at the CFA Institute, and eventually came across degrowth, but was thinking, wow, this is my job. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, and it took me so long to hear about this. It shouldn't be like that for other people. So he started a Substack several years ago and then got connected with us. And then we co-founded Arketa Institute about 2 years ago. Our hypothesis was staying, if not embedded, then adjacent to our industry peers while bringing these new ideas and using this psychologically informed peer-to-peer approach in our communications would be an effective way to engage people within the financial industry. We're still fairly new, but over this first year and a half or so, we've seen that playing out much more than I would have originally expected. Not enough people are looking at this intersection of limits to growth / degrowth / post-growth / well-being economy plus finance. At that intersection of degrowth and finance, there was very little interest because understandably, people that are interested in degrowth care about what financial professionals call the real economy. They care about providing for well-being needs within planetary boundaries. That's the whole goal. And finance, as this industry that at best moves financial resources around, say, to finance infrastructure projects that we need to have in the future. We move assets, financial capital that we have in the present into the future. At worst, it's all of the froth on top of the real economy, right?
Or even like removing the foundations of the economy in a way, isn't it? Because we're like sort of drawing down on our ecological sort of foundations.
Yes, you can argue that finance is accelerating that while not necessarily causing it directly. It's putting pressure on firms, say publicly traded companies, to be as extractive as possible because that's what shareholder primacy is like. You should prioritize paying us back as much as possible over properly compensating employees or others in your supply chain or doing anything that would allow for the long-term sustainability of your business, like caring for the environment or making sure that you're not polluting so much that you'll undermine the foundations of your entire business model.
Yeah.
So finance is heavily but slightly less directly implicated. In fact, many of my colleagues that are in the so-called sustainability space, say working in corporates or also more in social entrepreneurship spaces, they're affected by this, whether they're aware of it or not. Because when you, as a well-meaning person within a large corporate, bring together a project, you've got all these different stakeholders on board, you have an amazing idea, you pitch it to the CEO, they say it's okay, and the board says, nah, that's because they don't immediately see the connection between that initiative and financial returns in the short term.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add a comment on what you were saying about yourself, Matt, Steve, and to some extent myself from choosing to remove myself rather than think, what can I do with my existing networks? We often want to opt out and leave, and it's this pursuit of saying, I'm not causing harm anymore. I'm okay because I'm not involved. But that still isn't looking at where we sit within the system. Steve could have removed himself, being a professor, being able to clean his hands. But the very fact that he's in that network, he's part of that, he can talk to peers in ways that no academic can. I just think that's really, really powerful. It's a way of bridging that individual pursuit of trying to drive change, but also where's this systemic leverage that you have as one person?
Yeah, totally. This also relates to ideas of moral purity that we need to move beyond as a climate or green movement and as a culture more broadly. This idea that we as individuals can somehow be separate from extractive and destructive and harmful economic processes, and that we can have a hierarchy of who is more pure. Oh, if you took an airplane last year or whatever, you lose a bunch of cred. Some of that is important and coming from a good place. And there's also this aspect of how do we use shame and accountability in our movements in ways that can help us be more accountable to each other. That I think are important. That being said, though, the current economy doesn't acknowledge our right to be able to live in right relationship with other living beings. We are not enabled to live undestructive lives, especially those of us that are living in these weird contexts, Western, highly educated, industrialized context, just by the very nature of our economies, which again have developed on the basis of neoclassical economics, expecting that they could grow forever, without entirely removing yourself and doing this kind of individualistic homesteading thing. It is effectively impossible to live in a way that is genuinely sustainable in these kind of economies. So the idea that we could personally escape that, we mostly need to move beyond this idea that that's the goal and rather recognize, okay, we were born into this messed up system. Wherever we are, that's where we need to start. We need change across the entire economy. So wherever you find yourself, whatever networks you have at your disposal, whatever your skills are, whatever your passion is, that's where you should start, not where someone else should start. We're all in some different constellation of power and privilege and access, or we all have some combination of those. When we think about ourselves as actors trying to support or enable systems change, that mindset can be very helpful of, I can't pretend that I'm separate from the system, like the system is embedded in me.
Exactly. And I will make sure to add to the show notes the episode I did with Alexis Shotwell. Her entire work, her book Against Purity, is what actually helped me totally understand I am in an extractive system, full stop. I cannot be this pure 100% perfect vegan who causes no harm with anything I do, because by virtue of being in that system, I am unknowingly, unwittingly causing harm without even being responsible personally. It's that idea of navel gazing at what can I do or what can I not do, without thinking, where am I in this web of suffering, as Alexis Shotwell calls it, and what is something only I can do. So maybe that's a good pivot, because you talked about the just transition. If you are a finance professional, a wealth manager, someone maybe with a lot of your own personal privilege of money or shares or whatever it could be, what would you recommend to them? How can they be part of this change without seeking just that personal purity for themselves?
So on the individual or personal finance side, that's not a topic that we at Arketa Institute focus a lot about, but there are some resources that we can point people to that if they're interested in that. For instance, this financial activism playbook and zine, we can put the link to that. That's, I think, a very helpful resource. Also, with the divest movement, and people have become aware of the fact that their bank might be supporting fossil fuels in various ways. And that awareness, I think, has been very helpful. The offerings in response to that from the finance industry of like, here's our ESG fund that includes the best performing oil companies has been insufficient. But there are resources like Bank for Good, or the FIBIA is the ethical banking network in Europe that listeners can check out if they're considering changing banks. In the UK, I know there's Triodos. I'm not sure who else. You can switch to a bank that's supporting the kinds of projects of economic development in your community that you want to see, and that are, if not fully degrowth aligned, then at least more in that direction than typical commercial banks would be. But on the other side of that, what can financial professionals do wherever they find themselves? Our first paper is a good place to start. In that paper, we compare neoclassical and ecological economics and the implications for finance. We'd also encourage them to get in touch with us. We have a monthly online happy hour where people that are curious about what post-growth or the limits to growth in finance mean for our industry and want to have open conversations about that, they can find the information about that either on our LinkedIn page or in our newsletter. We're building a community around that, which again is further along than I would have expected. After
such a good sign.
I basically thought that no one was going to want to talk to us when we started Arketa Institute, because people in finance like to see numbers going up, and we're talking about some numbers at least hopefully coming down. But at least from our limited experience so far, people are actually much more ready to have these conversations than many of us expect. And that relates to your research as well. This idea of pluralistic ignorance and the fact that we expect others to be much more conservative than we are, when in fact they would like to pursue many of the same things. But if we never talk about it, we never know. There's also overlap in our work where we want to do a similar survey together with the colleagues at LSE to get a broader picture of ideas around the economy and planetary boundaries and degrowth policies.
Maybe even a year or two ago, it might have seemed like this is potentially radical, that we're trying to question norms. But actually, you were telling me before that there are people with a lot of clout already saying these things too. You mentioned the UK Actuaries Planetary Insolvency report and the dashboard. They're already saying our disregard for ecological limits is already undermining our economy. So it's not a quiet topic that's happening over here. Do you think there is the ground shifting a bit here, around finance as usual?
I mean, we still need to be realistic about this. In a larger scheme of things, this is still a very, very niche topic, right? We're talking about sustainable finance, which is, I mean, there's different numbers around it, but let's say a smaller subset within finance as usual, which is broader. We have impact investing, which is a small part of that. What we were talking about is small, tiny. Actually, Triodos could potentially be on that path. The ethical banking movement is primarily doing the kinds of investments that we would consider degrowth aligned. So there are institutions and people that are doing that, but not necessarily using the word post-growth finance. So it's still, I would say, quite niche. But what I think is interesting is that these conversations are happening behind closed doors. So a lot of the people that we talk to, they'll say our analysts know all about degrowth. And of course they do, because their entire job is to understand and to be able to expect what's going to happen in the economy in the future. So it needs to be on your radar, whether you subscribe to the moral ideas or political movement that goes along with it or not. It's a phenomenon that you need to expect. And when I say degrowth, we're referring to a conscious and democratically decided reduction of production and consumption in the global north, primarily, that focuses our economy on well-being needs and is able to make space to provide for everyone within planetary boundaries. So that's what degrowth is. And that's intentional. So our first paper is called By Disaster or Design. There's also the possibility that the economy becomes smaller and that we decrease production and consumption and needs fulfillment due to disaster, due to continuing with the business as usual path, which people think is safer because it's what they know. But we have every reason to believe, based on scientific evidence, that it's not safe at all. So if your job is to predict what's going to happen in the economy, it's important to be aware that we're speeding towards some kind of wall or cliff. Either we're going to acknowledge that collectively and decide what we want to do about it, which is the by design degrowth path. Or we're going to keep speeding full steam ahead and just find out.
I agree. You mentioned business as usual. And if you look at the donut economics framework for what business should be, they talk about finance is one of their critical pillars. Given that how they seek funding, where they get their money from, has these growth-oriented terms and conditions. Could you maybe talk a bit more about what are the alternatives to that, whether you're a founder or just for people to understand a bit more about how can we break that chain of growth being the core driver of everything?
Yeah, so for founders, there's a lot of narratives in startup world about oh, this is what you do. You build the thing, you get VC funding for the thing, you scale the thing, and then you get out. That's pretty much the life cycle of a startup in the best case, right?
Yeah,
So-called
the point is to
case.
exit, isn't it? The point is to get your money and to leave it, basically.
Yeah, conventionally, yes. Even within social entrepreneurship, though, just I think, say, because of the other models being less present, that's still often the expectation of okay, we're starting our social enterprise and we're going to try to grow it and we're going to try to get funding. And then basically, depending on what that funding looks like, either we will be able to maintain our mission or we won't. And that's because of the mechanisms of mainstream finance that come in and force you to deliver shareholder returns before anything else. And unfortunately, this is even the case with most impact VC, impact venture capital, that wants to support social enterprises, but is still expecting crazy growth and returns to make their investment worth it.
Yeah, so they're almost still operating through that neoclassical economics. They're halfway there, but they're forgetting that the world is embedded in ecological systems.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's this idea that I mentioned before of like every tool that you reach for, like, I know how to do private equity. Like, cool, I'm going to turn that into impact investments, but the underlying mechanisms are still the same because that's all we know. And like the fact that like neoclassical economics is so embedded makes it so that imagining anything beyond that is effectively impossible. I mentioned at the very beginning that my first bachelor's was about innovation and creative problem solving. That is not a mindset that's really taught to people that are on a mainstream business MBA or a finance track. Not at all. There are plenty of creative people that are working in finance, but the palette that they have at their disposal is only tools that are based on neoclassical economics.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because how can we expect to offer alternatives if we can't even see out of that mainstream story?
Yeah. We can't see the water that we're in,
Exactly.
which is neoclassical economics.
Exactly. Yeah. And I also want to make sure we have time to talk about one of your most recent papers, post-growth pensions, because it's the same point that we all think about retirement in the same mainstream way of you must have a pension, you have to make sure you're financially secure into old age. But what your paper talks about is it's not just about financial capital. There are other kinds of value. So we can talk about that as another frontier for imagining something different.
Yeah, I think that the pension paper has some ideas in it that are pretty applicable for anyone. So in our first paper, we talk about this concept that has been floating around impact investing circles for a few years, this idea of multi-capital. So there's not just financial capital, which is money that investors usually think about and work with. There's also manufactured capital, which are things like your house, your water purification system, the roads in your town, or your community solar project. You have social capital, which is institutions primarily, so organizations fit there, or political context and community organizing bodies. You have human capital, which is your health and skills, which, as you can imagine, is pretty central in the context of thinking about retirement. And the basis for all of those other kinds of capital, which is natural capital.
Yes, and that's the key thing, isn't it? That's the basis of everything else.
Exactly. In the neoclassical mindset, all of those forms of capital are interchangeable. I can buy $50 worth of trees and exchange it for $50 worth of building materials for my house. And it's not the mindset that I personally have. So it's a bit harder for me to imagine like how those could all be interchangeable. But basically in that model, that's how it's seen as like, okay, we can convert the value of the house into financial capital, and then we can use that to buy more health because we buy supplements or we buy a gym membership. However, in ecological economics, we recognize that they're not. They're not equal and they're not directly interchangeable. Natural capital is the basis for all those other kinds of value. We can't have social capital in space, like if we're just floating around in a vacuum. Like literally that will not happen.
We'll have to tell Elon Musk that.
Yeah.
That's another topic for another podcast episode.
Exactly. We better avoid that for now. But yeah, so we recognize that natural capital is the frame in which any of these other forms of value can possibly exist. And unlike in more mainstream impact investing conversation, we are also moving into thinking about multi-capital returns. So the idea that direct investments in conservation, so investments, I'm calling them investments, but like that would be any kind of money that you move towards regenerative agriculture or stopping land use change or like anything that contributes to natural capital, that would be a direct benefit to you because you're reducing the overall risk in the planetary system. That's what we want to do because like the level of risk in the planetary system is incredibly high. And part of what we talk about in that paper is that this is extremely relevant for pension funds who are looking over a third of the world's capital, a huge, huge amount that is workers' money, savers' money, hundreds of millions of people's money. And they have a time horizon that is going to be pretty challenging given the way that the next 40 years is probably going to look. Well, people have already been talking about ideas like the carbon bubble or universal ownership as a relevant topic for institutional investors like pension funds. Because they apply what's called modern portfolio theory, institutional investors have highly diversified portfolios. They're invested in the whole global economy, mostly concentrated in the global north, like 97% of their investments are probably what we would call the global north. Maybe 3% in the best case is in what's called emerging markets. Why the idea of universal ownership is important is because it means that damage that is caused by some parts of your portfolio, say your oil and gas investments, directly affects or eventually affects the performance of other aspects of your portfolio, because it's creating more natural disasters and it's displacing people and it's causing health problems. Like, some of that you're going to profit from. That idea has been around for a while, but because we're still largely in this neoclassical economic mindset, the reality of quite how much systemic risk is currently within the current system and not being accounted for is like, it's huge. Steve says sometimes it's like we're flying a plane, but all of our little dials are off. So we think, oh, we're totally fine. And the mountain is like literally right there, but we can't see it because we don't have the mechanisms to see it, because we think nature is still fundamentally separate from the economy. So the pension paper talks about how that poses a very serious problem for pension funds, because there isn't just a carbon bubble, right? Say around real estate in coastal areas and oil that might stay in the ground and all those kinds of things that we think about when we think about the climate change or CO2. There's also bubbles around almost every part of the economy, because there's bubbles around all of the planetary boundaries that we aren't acknowledging.
And at some point, they're going to pop, and that's going to impact the retirement funds of hundreds of millions of workers.
Mm-hmm. So what's different is that previously we were using this diversification approach because the idea was, if one business pops or if one industry even pops, like the .com crash or what we see right now, like AI bubble, like that's going to burst at some point. But the idea was, if you own all these little pieces of all of the parts of the economy, that won't affect you too much because other things will still be doing okay. What's different about now is that there's going to be so many bubbles popping across so many parts of the economy, either in a disaster situation or in a degrowth situation where we choose to phase out certain forms of production and consumption, that pension funds and other investors of any kind, they're just not prepared to deal with. So that's what we want to have a conversation about. We've been presenting that to pension funds where possible. We've been invited to speak at a sustainability conference of the Swiss Association of Actuaries, which is a pretty big deal. Actuaries are basically the professionals that look at future risk for insurance companies or banks or other institutions. Mm-hmm. You mentioned before the UK Actuaries Planetary Solvency report. What does it say? Well, the outlook is pretty dire, as many of us in the climate or sustainability worlds already know. But this is not climate activists or climate scientists. This is people within the financial system that analyze risk for a living, are saying that at 3 degrees of warming, it's likely that half of the world's human population would die. And that would be coupled with at least a 50% reduction in global GDP. There's some band of uncertainty around those numbers, but it conveys the severity of what we're up against. What's crazy, Matt wrote a post about this a while ago called Tale of Two Actuaries. That report is from the UK. In Canada, the actuaries came out and said, it's just a blip on the radar. It's not going to be that big of a deal. And I mean, Carbon Tracker did a similar report, which was like, all of the pension funds and people that are advising them think 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, even 4 degrees or 5 degrees, which, for the record, climate scientists don't even talk about. I think that will not significantly affect the economy.
Because of the dogma. It's almost like a dogmatic response. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. well, we're doing our best. We're looking at our models, which are based on neoclassical economics. We don't see the problems. And they, importantly, still get paid to do that, because that's a much easier thing to sell a pension fund than what we're saying, which is, well, things are looking pretty bad, and we should have a conversation about what could change more fundamentally in order to become more resilient and deliver for your beneficiaries. So what we've found is that among pension fund managers and others in that industry, people are aware and very concerned about these risks and the future. It's just very difficult for them to see what their next steps could be. And they can't come out publicly and say anything about this struggle to reconcile these things, because it would involve effectively admitting that their business model isn't going to work. Because, say, people my age or younger won't be able to get as much out of their pension fund in 20 or 30 years as they had expected. I mean, that would be a very serious problem. What we're trying to do together with other NGOs that engage with pension funds is make that conversation safer, more accessible, to talk about these risks that they're facing and that we're facing collectively, and then to move towards not just a future where everyone gets their paycheck from their pension when they retire, financial capital, but where we have all of these different forms of value in ways that allow for real well-being in retirement, which is in fact something totally different.
Thank you. And I'm aware that we've covered a lot of quite challenging topics, in the sense that not just scientifically or, it's also emotionally challenging to talk about these things. Like, you're saying at 3 degrees, half of the world's population dead. These aren't easy topics. And maybe for us to wrap up this, I think this will be a first episode of many. Are there any other resources that you'd want to point listeners to? And how can people find you and also Arketa and connect with the work?
Yeah, sure. So in response to what you said about these topics being very challenging, indeed, they are psychologically very challenging. I think it's reasonably clear at this point that people don't engage in climate action, not because they don't care or because they don't know enough, but in many ways because fully recognizing the extent of the problem is genuinely intolerable. Because, as I mentioned before, we are not enabled to live lives in right relationship by the current economy. So that is indeed very hard. And I think it weighs on all of us, whether we're aware of that or not. In that sense, at least in my personal experience, where there have been periods where this was extremely crushing and felt genuinely terrible and intolerable, I've found that actually admitting the extent of the problem to oneself and starting to engage with action of various kinds can be very helpful and therapeutic. At the Partners for a New Economy gathering in Lyon recently, there was a quote shared that something like, "Oh yeah, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up." Like, we create hope through action. It's not just something that we can opt into passively by saying, "Oh, I'm going to be hopeful now because maybe someone will take care of it." That is a much more fragile and less helpful, less nourishing kind of
hope. It connects to Joanna Macy's work around active hope as well. That idea of it, you have to act in order to feel hopeful without any guarantees.
Yes, 100%. So I think that at least has been helpful for me. But in the larger scheme of things, I do think that becoming more competent at emotion regulation is actually one of the most impactful things we can do for engaging with climate action or for addressing societal problems, whether that's through meditation or physical practices or therapy or finding those things that you can use to boost your mood or care for yourself, even as we exist in these destructive systems. So I would encourage everyone to take personal care and care for others pretty seriously in this context, not as a luxury, but as something that's necessary for radical change. We are here speaking primarily to financial professionals, so anyone that's in the industry that would like to have a deeper discussion, they're welcome to reach out. Anyone that has a pension fund, that's another opportunity for action. A friend and colleague of mine did something similar got elected to the board of trustees of her company's pension fund and used that to invite us in to have this presentation to their pension fund managers and board of trustees and C-level leadership of that large European corporation. So that is a way that people can have impact and people can reach out to us. We're happy to support with that. The only other resource that I was going to recommend is Good Grief Network. So Good Grief Network provides like groups online and in person for people to help process climate emotions, which is very helpful. Also climate cafes and other initiatives. You can look for those sorts of things in your town or start one to open up conversations about that I think is very helpful.
Thank you. I think that's a really nice way to end it, because we are focusing on starting with ourselves, regulating ourselves, processing our own emotions, but then the work that you're doing is at systemic level as well. So it's really nice to bring those two in conversation with each other. Thank you so much for your time today, and I would love to continue this. I think we have so much more to cover in a future episode as well, but thank you. It's been really, really great to talk to you.
Yeah, we'd be happy to. Thank you so much, Jeni.
Thank you.